So we were really excited today to have the Paramount School of Excellence with us, a charter school here in Indianapolis, and we've visited there a couple of times. We've talked with some compliance issues, just other best practice issues, lots of different things, and we thought they had an interesting story. It'd be nice for you to see one of your own and talk through what they've done with special ed, kind of the evolution of special ed at a charter school. So thank you guys very much for coming.
Thank you. So I am Tommy Reddicks, the Executive Director of Paramount School of Excellence. This is Stephanie Ritter. She's our Director of Special Education at Paramount School of Excellence. What we're going to try to do for you today is give you kind of a look into our school, some of the issues that we've dealt with, but we're by no means perfect, and so we've had our ups and downs. But we're heading into our 6th year this year, and so our journey from when we first opened to now, I think, is a neat look. So we're going to talk about our demographics. We're going to talk about some of the myths about charter schools and special education. We're going to talk about some of our personal issues with compliance and complaints, and then finish it up with how we deal with communication. So we'll start you out with just a look at who and how we are. We opened in 2010 with 368 students. 14.4% was our special education population in our first year. We were feeling fairly cozy at that number, and that was really kind of nice when we first opened up. It got even cozier in 2011. We had a great ratio of only 55 special education students out of 462 in our overall population for a whopping total of 11.9%. But you can see in years 3 and 4, we started to get some market corrections. In year 3, we moved up to 532 students, but still only at 12.8% with the special education population. But in year 4, either word got out or the market came back and made it all true, because we jumped 5% in our population, and suddenly we were at almost 100 students and 17.9%. And this year, we're right at 650 students, a population of 17.7%, and our demographic breakdown is on the right. You'll see that African American, we're 56%, Hispanic 10, white 32, and a free and reduced lunch count of 90 when it comes to our poverty rate.
So according to the U.S. Department of Education in 2006, approximately 13.5% of all students were receiving special education services. So that number has probably jumped a little bit since 2006, and they're probably sitting around 15% now. Our special education percentage is at 17.7%, and IPS schools that surround us are at 18%. So we're right at the same rate as them, and you'll really, in urban schools, always see a higher percentage of special education students.
Yeah, and I neglected to tell you where we were. So we are located right in the middle of IPS. We are on the near east side of Indianapolis in zip codes 46201, 46202, 46218, 3 of the harder zip codes to serve on the east side of Indianapolis. We're about, I'd say, 1.5 miles due east of downtown.
So I'm just going to kind of give you a snapshot of what it looks like to be in our school and to be in special education, and what our least restrictive environments look like. So we do provide general education to a majority of our population. That looks with either pull-out groups or push-in groups. We do a lot of push-in in middle school, especially in math, because we tend to have a strong special ed population in mathematics. So we do a lot more push-in with them. We determine what services are needed by our data. We do M-class and acuity. We really dive into those data. We see what kids are close, which ones are further, and we provide services according to that. We also always align our curriculum to the general education setting. So our general education teachers send us their lesson plans. If they're working on theme, that's what we are working on also. We want to make sure we're aligning so that students are just getting, double instruction on those different topics. We also do resource room, but we are unique in that we are a smaller school and we only have one special education room. So we do our pull-out groups and our resource room in the same location. The resource room are for kids that need more intensive instruction, and again, it's based on data. Those students usually have modified curriculum to go more at their level and less at grade level. But again, if they are working on theme, we're going to work on theme, but instead of doing it at a 4th grade level on grade level, we may be doing 2nd grade reading passages. So again, we're aligning that curriculum, but we're working on the same concepts. And our last is self-contained or modified self-contained. Again, we only have one special education room. So our self-contained or modified self-contained is going to be having a student working one-on-one in a classroom in our room all day while pull-out groups are going around them. We do this either because of high behavioral needs, students that are acting out in the classroom causing major disruption for the general education setting, or greatly below level students. We do have mild cognitive, some moderate cognitive students, so those students are going to be more in a modified self-contained. Again, we're either doing grade level curriculum if that student is a behavior problem but at grade level, or a modified depending on if that student is well below grade level. Something else that we do on a regular basis is teacher training. Something new that we have started this year is our new teacher academy. Teachers that are 1 or 2 years at our school are participating in monthly professional development that covers a wide range of different things. For example, this month we are actually doing a professional development. We are partnering with the Indiana Department of Education, IM, to do an academic and behavioral special education presentation. So we make sure our new teachers understand special education law and what is expected of them in the classroom, both with behavior management and academics. Along with that, we have monthly all-staff meetings. Those take place at the beginning of every month, and I usually at least present for at least 5 minutes. I will look at what are teachers struggling in for that month, or what did I see in the past month that really we could use a refresher course on. And kind of a trick that we do with this is that we will actually have teachers sign off on those monthly professional developments or those monthly discussions that we are having. So they are receiving monthly professional development through me on topics that are concerned in special education. So it's a way that if a parent goes and files a complaint and they're like, well, you haven't trained your staff properly on behavior intervention plans. I have documentation that we talked about behavior intervention plans at the beginning of the year before school even started. Teachers signed off on behavior plans. Oh, and then the November professional development for all staff, we talked about it again. So I have evidence that we are talking about that across the entire school year. And then we also do weekly grade level team meetings. We have a common prep time at our school for grade levels. So all of 4th grade is on prep at the same time. So once a month, I go to those grade level team meetings and discuss topics, again, of concern. Last month, we talked about accommodations and modifications and what those would look like in the classroom. So that's just another way that we are weekly, monthly, giving professional development opportunities for our staff. Another big part is accessibility. That is something that has to be done. We do all of these things in our school, but they're things that if you have students that come to your school that need these, they need to be done also. So if we have students that come in that require one-on-ones, we will provide those one-on-ones with them. It may cost us more money, but it's written in their IEP and it has to be done. We currently have a student in a wheelchair that requires one-on-one assistance all day. So when she first came in, it was an adjustment period, but she needs it. She has to have it to be successful, and so she gets that one-on-one. We do modifications in PE so that our students in wheelchairs can participate in PE fully. We also have access to the playground equipment. We have a modified swing. We have teachers, one-on-ones, people that go out and help at recess so that they are able to participate. We give alternate ways for them to participate, whether it's iPad outside. We'll provide beaded blocks for them to do outside, coloring outside. And what you find is when you let that student take those things outside, the other students that are like, hey, we don't get to do that. Can we come over? And they kind of join in on those activities as well. We had to have a changing table installed because we had a student last year that required changing. We now have 2 students that require changing. So that was something that we didn't have previously, and we have gotten because it is required because of the student's IEP. We work with several outside vendors. We have our speech, our OT, and our physical therapist through Easter Seals, so we have communication with them on a daily basis. And this year we have a student that is deaf, hard of hearing. So we are in contact with the Center for Deaf, Hard of Hearing Education. They come in on a weekly basis also to work with that student. So again, if it's in their IEP, we make sure to provide those services. We have elevators and ramps for mobility, and then assistive technology devices. We have computers for classrooms and our students. We had applied for a grant 3 years ago to get iPads for all special education students, so we currently have that. We've got an Alpha Smart for our student in the wheelchair for our communication mode, and FM systems for our hard deaf of hearing students.
Now this sounds really, really cool because we've got all this great stuff for our special education kids, but we didn't go on a shopping spree. We're mandated to have these things, and if you try to fight the system and not provide these, then it's going to kick back in a legal way and really hurt you. So we're proud of these kinds of things that we can offer for our student, but it is born out of necessity and out of accessibility. So speaking along those same terms about what you can have versus what you should have versus what you're mandated to have, we get into myths. And I think myths are a really interesting thing in the charter world because many of you in the room and online might realize every single myth I'm talking about as an absolute myth, but we're also having these myths propagated by those outside of the charter community. So we're hearing a lot of people that will, at least when I'm out and about in the community, tell me, oh, you don't have to take special education students in charter schools, you're lucky. I mean, wait a second. It doesn't really work that way. So I think the myth busting goes two ways in the Indiana community because charters are so new that getting the knowledge out there is really important, but also within our community, we still have a few schools out there that don't really realize what are the have-tos and what are the maybes. So we'll get into a couple of statements that get real interesting. So the first one is that charter schools aren't required to have a special education program. Many of you might say, yeah, I've known that since I was born. But I hear this almost every year from either charter school leaders or charter school special education directors or just community members in general who don't know about charter schools. And there's some sub-myths here that charter schools do not have to accept students with special needs. Charter schools do not have to serve special education students with needs that exceed the school's staffing or facility capacity. I think that's really one of the larger ones that I hear more often, is that we're not staffed for that. Sorry, we can't handle a wheelchair kid. We can't do changing the middle of the day. We don't have an extra person. If we had that person, we'd love to take your child. I think those things are happening still in our charter communities, and it's important to realize that the two students that we have at our school in a wheelchair, we knew as soon as they walked in the door, this is going to cost us a lot of money, and this is going to cost us a lot of human time. But we don't have an option. We have an open seat in that grade level. And in Indiana, if you've got an open seat in that grade level and there's an application and that's the student wanting to come into your school, you're going to welcome them with open arms whether you're smiling about it or not. The next is that charter school special education law is dictated by the school's charter and is upheld by the school's authorizer and not any other agency. I think there's a lot of confusion about where the line is drawn about who pulls the strings. Does your charter application, does your charter with your authorizer dictate your special education program, or is there a higher power? A lot of schools still seem to feel like their authorizer is that authorizing body, so they can say whether or not you're going to have a full-fledged special education program that has to be open to everybody, or maybe your charter application to your authorizer says, yeah, we'll have a program and here's how it goes, but anything beyond that, we're out. It's definitely a myth. Your authorizer can oversee and suggest things for you, and we'll talk a little bit more about the difference between the authorizer control and state control, but definitely the state supersedes your authorizer in terms of special education law. So the sub-myths here are charter schools do not have to adhere to the IDOE for special education reporting. You may try to not adhere to the IDOE. It's going to kick back on you. The next one is charter schools are not subject to IDOE special education audits. Again, you can say I don't have to adhere to the audit until the auditor shows up at the door. And you can kick that auditor out, and they'll probably walk away. But boy, it's going to get ugly. So those are things we're all held to. So special education in charter schools, I've got two big L words here. Legitimate is the most important L word on the board. But for someone in my position as charter school director, litigious is a very scary word. That means, can you be sued? Are we looking at legal issues here? How do I defend my school from a legal battle, from a legal situation? Because to me, I'm not as scared of a legal battle as I am the money it costs to fight it. And that can take down a school. So that's really, really scary. But our two big important reasons are special education students can make up 20% of your student body. Right now we're at 17.7, IPS average is 18. Nationally we're closer to 15, so I would say most of the schools in this room and online are anywhere between 12 and 20%. And I may be wrong, but I'm definitely in the wheelhouse there. So That's 20% of your population that probably won't succeed without careful attention to the needs that they have, to the IEP maintenance, to the accommodations, to the modifications that are made to ensure that they can have some chance of success and free access to public education. The second is an overwhelming majority of legal cases brought against schools are related to special education. We scoured the internet. I know there's a number out there, but we scoured trying to find what this percentage was nationally. And I'd be willing to bet it's 90 or 95%. That all cases brought against schools, 90 to 95%, I'm betting, not guaranteeing, I'm betting are special education related. So from a safety standpoint of keeping my schools safe, I'm really scared of that. And I want to make sure I'm doing everything possible to keep my school out of the legal system because of something that we're not doing in special education. There's kind of a third point here when you're looking at ISTEP and student success, that if 20% of our students are in special education, what percent of them need to pass ISTEP for our school to have a successful grade on ISTEP? So if I've got 20% of my school, let's say that 10% of those students are in a testable grade level, grades 3 through 8. We're a K-8 school. So that's 10%. And if my school's performing at a C, and we're talking inner city Indianapolis, C is not a horrible grade. But I lose 10% because we're not helping our special education kids as much as we possibly can, and we end up as a D school, suddenly we're an improvement and heading down a slippery slope. So that's kind of another side reason to where you want to make sure your accommodations are spot on. You want to make sure that you're giving them every possible chance to succeed because you need them. That's 10% of your testable population. So this is kind of the fun part. I love case studies. To me, that brings things into reality. So we're going to talk about areas where we've messed up a little bit, and we've hit some road bumps, and talk about what got us in that situation, how we resolved that situation, the time it took to get through the situations, and then we're going to come out of that with talking about communication, kind of what we learned through the process, and how complaints can be scary. But I think we've had a complaint every single year since we've been open, some years more than one. It's kind of a part of the process. Parents of special education students advocate very strongly for their kids. And more, our area advocacy groups are supporting those parents and helping them through the complaint process. So if you aren't doing something right, someone's probably going to make a complaint. And if you are doing something right, someone's probably going to make a complaint. Because you advocate very strongly for your child. And if you feel like something's wrong, if your special education student's getting into a disciplinary situation and you think they've been wronged, you're probably headed down that path. And so I don't want to beat a dead horse since we just talked a lot about complaints earlier, but I think it might validate a lot of what we've already heard today.
All right, our first case study, a complaint. The school expelled an ED student inappropriately. The school did not provide for service during the process of the expulsion. Details. This student in particular brought a tobacco product into the school building and was sharing with other students. The proof was contested alongside claims that the reasons for expulsion were invalid. So we sat down at a manifestation meeting with this parent. At that time, the parent also had an advocate that joined the conference via phone. During that time, the magic 2 questions that were talked about earlier during a manifestation meeting, both the parents, the advocate, and the school all said no to both of those questions. It did not have to do with her disability, and it did not have to do with the school's failure to implement the IEP. Following the manifestation, the school moved to expel the student based on our policy when it comes to discipline. Immediately after that, a Department of Education complaint was filed by the parent. The resolution was that it was found that the student expulsion was handled correctly, but the school was required to make up for services that weren't offered during that period of investigation, manifestation, and expulsion. So the student had excelled, had gone past those 10 days before the manifestation, and we did not meet to discuss the services for change of placement. So we had to make up those service times and then come up with a plan for continuing service times after the expulsion. The parent then added further needs by insisting that the school provide the extended school year services. Since the school was providing a summer school program, that was met by the parent. We found a way to get the student extended school year services during that time. So the total time for this case, which includes from the time the manifestation started to the complaint was filed to the documentation to the talking between multiple staff members and the parents, that took us a total of 4 months to complete.
And this was an interesting case in the fact that our concern here was that we thought we had a clean manifestation hearing and a clean expulsion. And we actually did. All that was fine. But we were still found that there were things that we could do better. It still came back to us that, no, we didn't provide services during this process. No, we didn't hold our change of placement meeting at the right time. So there was still a lot to be gleaned out of this where we thought we were in compliance. We weren't. There were still things we can do better.
Case number 2, the complaint was that the school was deliberately avoiding ED classification by referring troubled students straight to a mental and behavioral service without referring them for special education first. At our school, we have come-in school-based therapy, which is an outside source, but it works inside the school. So that's what that had to relate with. The details, an outside third party filed that complaint with the Indiana Department of Education. The complaint provides firsthand accusations insinuating that the school was not following the child find policy. So child find is the way you identify students for special education and put them into the evaluation process. The school was asked to provide proof the students had been qualified, the different designations that had been qualified by the school, also a list of students that we had submitted to the come-in therapy for referrals. We also had to submit our policies and procedures in relation to child find. The resolution was that the school was not found to have committed any fault in child find or lack of qualification. We were required to create a parent form that allows the acknowledgement of whether special education services were needed or wanted for that student. So because of this, we actually created a brand new referral form for our students into come-ins. And all of those referral forms now go through special education. And we, as a team, including general education teacher, administration staff, myself, and we try to involve the parent in that. We do involve the parent in that and have them sign off on whether or not we feel like special education services are needed for this child or if it's just something we're referring to come-ins. So we now have documentation that we aren't just pushing kids into that this is a service that the parents may be requesting either prior to special education testing or that special education isn't needed at all for this student. The total process for that took 3 months.
This is a really interesting case for me personally because here's a situation where we're kind of beyond the requirements of the law. The law doesn't say we have to get a sign-off from a parent for mental and behavioral services saying they don't want special education testing at that time. But we've gone ahead and instituted that based on IDOE recommendation, saying in order to get resolution in this case, these are the steps we should take. And within probably 2 or 3 months of them saying that and us feeling fairly frustrated that we would have to add this extra step, we had a parent whose student was up for expulsion and immediately tested this. And as soon as we had that document saying that they did not want their child tested prior to submission to behavioral and mental health services, that discussion was over. So, I mean, there is a good reason for it. It's not required by law. I think a lot of you might see a requirement like that and say, whoa, that's above and beyond what we'd ever want to do. And had we chosen that path, we would have chosen not to do it. But here it is. It's not law, but it was a recommendation by the DOE that actually came back within a couple months and solidified our system. So really interesting.
And our third case is the school did not comply with the student's behavior intervention plan prior to suspension. So the details, there was a child with an IEP that kicked a student down a flight of stairs. A couple of different staff members had witnessed this. The parent, after debriefing with the child, disagreed with the school's decision to have him suspended. The parent also involved an attorney, telling us that the child could not be suspended because it had a direct and substantial relationship to the child's disability. On that part of that, we agreed with the parent and the attorney that it did have to do with that, but the student had only been suspended 1 day prior to that, and we were only doing a 2-day suspension. So we were allowed to suspend him in terms of that part. Following a refusal by the school to rescind the suspension, parent filed a DOE complaint that the behavior intervention plan was not followed. The resolution. In this case, we found that the behavior plan was not followed. This particular student had to unpack as part of his IEP whenever he did something physical or verbally aggressive. And in our write-up, there were a couple of staff members that attempted to unpack with the student, but the student was refusing. Because we did not finish that process of unpacking because the student refused, we were not in compliance with his IEP. So we had to complete and document an all staff PD over behavior intervention plans. And it taught us something in terms of if this particular child is going to refuse to unpack with us, we know now that we continue that process with him. We will sit there. The unpacking process includes talking to the student about the behavior that occurred, how he was feeling during that behavior, how the other student was feeling, and things we could do next time. So if the student refuses to communicate with me in that moment, I will sit there and say, okay, so this is what happened. I bet you were feeling pretty angry at that time. You know, I say that student was probably sad that you kicked him. Next time, I think this is what we should do. Next time, let's do this. So I'm completing the unpacking process with him. I'm not just attempting to do it with him. Do you have a question?
I think you just answered it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was the strategy that we learned in the Institute with a lot of our autistic kids because it goes through the process of how did I feel, how did they feel, how are we going to fix it?
And it's documented, which makes it nice.
And it's documented in a little pretty colorful paper.
Right. One note on that is that this kind of cross applies to a lot of cases. I think we all get in the situation where we're doing our best to implement the BIP, but somewhere through that process things break down because we're no longer able to do that. Like, okay, well, staff got called away, or the student became resistant, you know, things like that. The parent picked the child up. Well, then you're suddenly in violation of that BIP. And you might get away with that 9 times out of 10, but here's a situation where it caught us, where we thought we were fulfilling our obligation because we went through the process of starting that, and he was in complete shutdown mode, and so we gave up. And under review, where was our proof that we did unpacking? We didn't have it. We had proof that we tried, and it was written proof. But we got called out on that, and I think rightly so, that, you know, it was kind of a mental adjustment for us to realize that these things need followed and documented every single time.
And it helped us feature this particular student goes on the daycare bus after school. We actually told the daycare bus to leave and had parent pick him up one day because he wouldn't unpack with us. And so we wanted to make sure after this incident that we did complete that process prior to sending the student home. So I think you take a lot away from those complaints and it just makes you better. And it made, in terms of all of these cases, we have documentation now that we didn't have before that can be used at any time. So it really has helped us. This particular case study took about 2 months to resolve, so not quite as long as the others.
So when you look at the time involved in complaints, we're not talking about advancing this into due process or getting into legal cases. So our first one was 4 months, and that's 4 months of time taken away from you at your school. Imagine if that goes legal. I mean, it could be 4 months plus 2 years plus the legal fees attached to that, and that's really what we want to avoid. And like I said, there's 2 reasons here. One, because of the legal, litigious nature of all of that and how expensive it can be. But the other is, gosh, you've got to learn from this so you know your students are treated the right way. So for us, the complaints are a system test. It's our 6th year now. So as a charter school, we take it a lot more comfortably than we did initially. Whenever you're doing something new and someone comes up and says, I challenge you on this, you always get defensive. It's impossible not to. It's human nature. So your first couple complaints are pretty scary. And especially your first couple complaints are probably coming back with someone telling you, you're wrong, you now need to do this, this, and this. And that leaves you feeling pretty upset, and then that generates some instant animosity towards those above you at the IDOE who might be handing these things down. But boy, we keep finding over and over again that this is just a great systems test, and I've got it bolded here. There's no better test for your system than a real-world accusation that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And as we've matured as a school, and we've got a long ways to go, we get hopeful when we head into a complaint that we've got it. And we're going to get through this, and someone's going to say, you know what, we find no fault here. Thank you for sending us all your information. I think that's happened one time in our coming into our 6th year now.
And it was exciting when it happened.
Yeah. But, you know, the other 5 times, we weren't getting shut down as a school. But we were being told that the following things need to be done, and there needs to be proof that they were done. And those things have been valuable for us as we move forward against any other tests of our policy. I love compliance with compliance. Sometimes, like you said, you can get very defensive about who you are, and you want to kind of put a fence around you and make sure that you're untouchable. That way everything's going to go the way that you want to do it. But findings from the DOE can be helpful. So from those findings, we've got more efficient procedures. We participate in multiple professional development opportunities. We continue the conversations with the IDOE on how to improve. We allow our authorizer to audit us every single year when we're only required to have that done once a year. And then we get better forms of documentation. It assists in the creation of more concise policies, procedures, provides professional development to all staff. So these are the outcomes of us being pushed a little bit and tested. And those aren't horrible outcomes. It's just a matter of making sure you're glass half full on that inner gut feeling when you feel like you're under attack.
IDEA, what is it? Anyone?
This is the community participation segment. It's really exciting.
Anyone, what is IDEA? It's the Individuals
and there it is.
Disability Education Act. FAPE, what is it? Free and appropriate public education. They're both federal mandates. You must be providing these to your students, and we can't ignore them just because we are a charter. So it's really important when we're talking about FAPE. Again, that least restrictive environment, that accessibility piece, those are the biggest parts of FAPE. You need to make sure that you are serving your kids in the most appropriate environment for them. So if that means trying to make your schedule, twist it around to make it work so that the kid that needs more resource time than your general education students get that, you need to make sure that you're finding a way to do that. The same thing with the self-contained and modified self-contained kids. It gets really hard when you have one classroom for special education and you have that ED kid that's throwing things, disrupting things, but you have to make it work. You have to find a way to serve those other kids, whether it's finding a different location for one of your staff members to take them to make sure they get their minutes while you are trying to get the other student to quit melting down. But it's finding a way to make it work so that all students are getting the appropriate education that they need.
Yeah, and I think there's some general confusion over what has to be provided for a student. And when you talk about least restrictive environment in FAPE, you don't have to build a second building to house kids because they got it a certain way in another school, but it needs to be relative to the education that other children are getting in your school. And so FAPE and LRE, you definitely get to mold and hold some of that in your building. That's why we only have one room. We can't afford to build another, but we still have to serve every child out of that room that needs it and abide by that IEP per that background. So a couple things for charter schools specifically that have been confusing for us that I wanted to share out, and potentially you're in the same boat. I think we've been able to navigate through this a little bit and get a better understanding, but there's some real differences between the authorizer and the state of Indiana, and this is something I mentioned a little bit earlier, so I'm going to talk about some of the primary differences that can get cloudy. The first thing is the difference between an authorizer concern and a state finding. If you're a charter authorizer, well, whether it's Trine or Ball State or the mayor's office, if your charter authorizer is coming to you saying, hey, FYI, I think your processes are bad here. I don't think that you're writing appropriate goals. It doesn't look like this child's getting LRE. You didn't do a manifestation hearing correctly. Those are strong suggestions for change. So you can tell your authorizer, hey, thank you, we'll look into that. And there doesn't necessarily have to be any follow-up, and you're not in a legal position. All the authorizer can do is strongly suggest until such point that they think you're so far out of compliance they're going to shut your school down. But newsflash, unless you're academically out or financially incapable, your authorizer's not shutting you down. And so your special education program might be really down in the dumps, and you might be getting strong messages from your authorizer, but they're probably not shutting you down for that. Where if the state walks in and they have a finding, and they find that you're not doing these processes correctly, that you're not handling your system correctly, well, this can result in a couple larger steps, like loss of special education grant, or pending lawsuits, or further pressure put on by the state that's going to mandate some immediate change at your school. So I think that a state finding needs to be taken as a mandate, an immediate mandate for change, where an authorizer finding, you know, any good school should still take that as a mandate, but you don't have as much strength backing that up unless your school's in a position of shutdown. The state does have a state chartering authority, but even that state authorizing body, and there's only a few schools involved in that, is in the same position. So if that state authorizing body says, hey, your special education program looks out of compliance, that's still your authorizer talking and not the Department of Education. So there's a clear difference there. Yes, she's asking, are there state authorizing bodies in Indiana? Is there a state authorizing body? And there is. And is there a difference between that authorizing body and what we're held accountable to through the Department of Education in special education? Is that right? Yeah. There is a distinct difference. One is an authorizing body who has an office in a state building who oversees charter schools. The other is the Department of Education with the legal team standing behind it saying these federal laws and Article 7 are all mandated and you must follow them now. Your authorizer can say the same thing, and if they're really good, they should be. But they can't push with the same poison when you're doing something wrong. Again, her question was, if your authorizer is the state, how do you determine who's coming in and who they are? You need to delineate that. You need to know, hey, is this our authorizer? Or is this the Department of Education? And if our authorizer is the Department of Education, there's a difference. I mean, you just need to say, is this our authorizer? You know, and your school director should be all over that and should know. But yeah, there's a big difference between the two. They may work, you know, near each other in a like building, but it's two different cubicles. It's like, you know, the difference between Allstate and Geico. You know, they might both be in a cubicle in the same building, but they're running two different programs. So. Yeah, that's great, and it's kind of a classic example of where the state receives something, and the state made action happen, and luckily Ball State then got with you to make that go, but I think it was still driven by the state to say, hey, something needs done here. Woke the authorizer up, the authorizer wakes the school up, and in the end we got something good, so yeah. So what's the difference between an authorizer review and a state review? Similar thing. An authorizer review might be your annual review that you have to do through your authorizer, which could show up as a giant report on the authorizer's website, and it's a public document that people can read and make their decisions whether or not they want to enroll there. That's not necessarily a document that is going to chase you down. That's just a public document, part of your annual review. That can be part of your charter renewal, which could be a very important document. But again, it's not going to carry the same significance as a state review, because your state review typically looks like a special education audit, where someone's showing up and they're going to tie back every dollar that you brought in to what's being spent, what resources you have, how it's being used, how it's being utilized. Or it could look like a legal review of your special education policies, your child find policies, those kinds of things, where you're going to need to produce immediate documents to show that you're aligned with state expectations. So winding down here, getting to communication. I think there's a real need to not be scared of communicating with the state, with your authorizer, with your stakeholders. And I'll let kind of Stephanie go down this list here and then add a little bit on the end.
Okay. So it's really important to be more proactive than reactive. Because charters will experience complaints, legal battles, the fluctuating special education populations. It's really important that you just kind of are transparent and have those communications. Having communication with the Indiana Department of Education is the best tool you can have. Participating in things like this is the best communication you can have, because it shows the Indiana Department of Education that you want to get better, you want to learn those things, you want to stay up to date with the laws. It shows that you are making an effort. If you don't go to any of these professional developments, you don't communicate with them, and then you have a complaint filed, and you aren't very willing to participate with them, they're probably going to look at you a lot different than if you come in saying, hey, this is what we have, this is what happened, what can we do? What did we do? How do I make this better? Charters can ask for visits to review their processes by both state and the authorizer. Like Tommy said, we are only required to have a special education audit through our authorizer every 2 years. we felt like in that year that we weren't getting audited by them, that we were maybe losing on things, some things were slipping through the cracks. So we now have them come in every year, with one of those being more informal, them just kind of coming around looking, saying, hey, you might want to work on this a little bit. You know, those type of things are helpful for us. Seeking out professional development, knowing that the SPED requirements and law should be part of each academic year. We go to all of these professional developments. I think there's usually a couple a year, and we normally go to both of them. I'm going to lots of professional development this month over various topics, but just to make sure that I'm staying up to date, and I can bring that back to the school. And then charter SPED departments should know that the stakeholders at both levels, so know who you should be talking to and communicating with to make sure that you're doing what you need to do.
Yeah, and those of you that aren't the executive director of your school, you need to not trust those people in those higher levels to take care of all this for you. Because I know in my situation, I like this. I like to be at the ground level, but I'm executive director of the school. So I'm not going to be like every other person. It's a direction I choose to drive. But what you really can't afford to do is sit back and, as your school special education support specialist or director or teacher, assume that someone else is bringing this knowledge to you. And, you know, things like brushing up on your SPED law, 504 law, having those really fun reads always around can be really, really good. And then, you know, I call it brown nosing or playing the game. I want our special education team to always be visible. We want to know Stephen Yaki personally. I want to know Kristen personally. We want to know Tracy. We want to get to know Matt better. These are ways that we're going to ensure that we're transparent. And when we're having issues, I want them at the school. I don't need to put a fence or an island around our school. We're a charter school. We have our own autonomy, but I want to be good. And I can't get there unless we're being super duper transparent. Those extra assessments that we ask for by our authorizer cost us $5,000 a year. So I'm spending an extra $5,000, but I'm guaranteeing my best shot at compliance. And boy, if that saves me from ever heading to court, that's money well spent. So it all revolves around communication, not being scared to ask for it. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you so much.